Hello everyone, it's Angelika Kargulewicz, clinical nutritionist, and in today's episode we will talk about gluten. What is gluten in fact, and in which food products we can find gluten? And is really a gluten-free diet such a healthy option, for example, for our gut? And the question is, for example, if people who suffer from Hashimoto's disease should follow this kind of dietary plan, I mean gluten-free diet. And for example, when we want to lose weight, it is good to choose a gluten-free diet. If you are interested in this issue, please stay with me today. First of all, gluten is of plant origin. We cannot find gluten in animal food products. Gluten is a protein that gives a desired characteristics to baked goods. It creates a colloidal formulation solution that gives elasticity. That's why when we are using, for example, wheat flour, we can create very good bread or, for example, pastries. Chemically, gluten is made up of prolamins and glutenins, and the main prolamins take different names. So, for example, we have gliadin in wheat, and also secalin in rye, hordein in barley, and avenin in oats. And the question is where we can find gluten. So for sure in wheat and its varieties like kamut, spelt, semolina or durum, but also in rye food products. For example, wholemeal and light rye bread, also wholemeal rye pasta, but also barley groats and, for example, oat flakes. We can also find gluten in cereal-based measures like bread rolls, pumpernickel, or, for example, couscous. We can also find gluten in foodstuff containing small addition of cereals, for example, like groats or grits in cold cuts, sausages or delicatessen food products, but also, for example, breadcrumbs in breaded products. We can also find gluten in products containing starches from gluten cereals, for example in the form of sauce, for example soy sauce or different broths. But we can also find gluten in drinks, like for example cereal coffee, but also in some alcohol like gin, beer or whiskey. And first of all, what are the obvious indications for gluten-free diet? For sure, autoimmune disease like celiac disease, but also gluten ataxia and During's disease, which is a cutaneous or skin form of celiac disease. And let's focus a little bit more on celiac disease, which is a disease caused by an autoimmune reaction. It is caused by a release of antibodies to the gluten protein, and it leads to the complete disappearance or so-called atrophy of the intestinal villi, which cease to fulfill their function. So here it is worth to mention that the proper functioning of the intestinal villi is crucial for the absorption, and in the situation of people who suffer from celiac disease, the villi are very short and it enables the absorption of important nutrients, and therefore they can develop very important nutritional deficiencies. Another suggestive symptoms of the celiac disease are bloating, but also chronic fatty diarrhea, anemia or weight loss. And it is worth to mention that sometimes celiac disease can be even diagnosed in older age. And the reconstruction of the intestinal villi after following a proper gluten-free diet can take from 6 months to even 2 years. And what is extremely important here, I would say that a proper diagnosis. It can be made using, for example, serological anti-tissue transglutaminase antibodies, but also advanced like intestinal biopsy. But what is important in both cases, in both kinds of diagnostic tools? So, for sure, few weeks before such kind of testing, there must be a gluten in a diet. If a patient follows a gluten-free diet before undergoing small intestine biopsy for the diagnosis of celiac disease, it may lead to a false negative result. This is because removing the gluten from a daily diet leads to gradual improvement and regeneration of the intestinal villi and a reduction in the inflammation, making the characteristic histopathological changes of celiac disease almost undetectable in the examination. It is important because not adequately confirmed celiac disease and not following a gluten-free diet in people who really suffer from celiac disease may affect the increased risk of cancer development, for example, small bowel lymphomas. Celiac disease requires lifelong complete exclusion of the gluten in the diet. People who suffer from celiac disease can only consume gluten-free food products with special symbol on it, and they also should be vigilant when it comes to food products that might be contaminated with the gluten. It cannot be the case, for example, that in the oven where wheat rolls are baked, the gluten-free ones are also baked, because even a small addition of the gluten, for example, as a Holy Communion or, for example, using the same toaster as the rest of the family, may be the reason for the lack of histological improvement. So, as you can see, following a gluten-free diet in people with celiac disease is not a joke. It has to be very strict. So it is very difficult to follow on a daily basis this diet, even going to the restaurant or, for example, taking part in a social event. It is extremely difficult, but worth it. Another indication for gluten-free diet is also an allergic reason, and this is the case of allergy to wheat, and in this kind of situation we need to exclude gluten mainly from the wheat. And there exists another situation when people exclude gluten from their diet, but here we do not have to do with allergic or autoimmune reasons, and the conditions is non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And such kind of the diagnosis like NCGS, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, can only be made after ruling out celiac disease and with allergy. And also we need to confirm so-called gluten dependency, which means that, for example, patient eats biscuits or, for example, wheat bread or even wholemeal pasta and experience undesirable symptoms. And what might be the potential symptoms of non-celiac gluten sensitivity? For example, abdominal pain, but also constipation, diarrhea, bloating, vomiting or nausea, rash, chronic fatigue and confusion, but also headaches. But note that the fructans, which is an ingredient found in wheat, barley or rye, not a gluten, can be a culprit of the symptoms. But even in the confirmation that we suffer from non-celiac gluten sensitivity, the diet does not have to be so restrictive how it is in the case of celiac disease. Another situation when a gluten-free diet might be introduced is an exacerbation of inflammatory bowel disease, like for example Crohn's disease or colitis ulcerosa. Why? Because here gluten might increase the intestinal permeability, but on the other hand, highly processed gluten-free food products might also have this effect. So in this situation we can introduce a natural gluten-free diet, but only periodically, for example for 2 weeks. Sometimes there is also a question if people with Hashimoto's disease should also follow a gluten-free diet, but the answer is that only in the situation of the coexisting celiac disease. Here we are talking about the strict gluten-free diet, and we should also remember that Hashimoto's disease is an autoimmune disease, very similar like celiac disease, so there is some risk that these two diseases can occur simultaneously, and in that kind of situation when the human being who is suffering from Hashimoto's disease and celiac disease, of course, should follow a strict gluten-free diet. And also very often I hear the question if gluten-free diet can help lose weight, but let's be honest, it's not a gluten as a culprit of increased body mass, but mainly highly processed food. And when it comes to weight loss, the main recommendation is to maintain energy deficit, not the exclusion of the gluten from a daily diet. So is it worth obsessively avoiding gluten in a daily diet? Of course, in the situation of people who suffer from celiac disease or wheat allergy, it is necessary. But what about healthy human beings? Let's remember that so-called rational or balanced diet means 1/2 of the products consumed are vegetables and fruits with a predominance of the vegetables, and not eating sandwiches, cakes or pastries all day long. If you want to limit gluten intake for personal reasons, you can always use very nutritious, natural pseudo cereals like buckwheat, quinoa, millet, rice or teff, and try to avoid highly processed gluten-free food products. They often contain a lot of additives, hydrogenated fats, and unfortunately less fiber, vitamins and minerals. And remember that highly processed gluten-free food products affects adversely the gut microbiota. Thank you for watching my video. If you like it, please leave the thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can also leave your comment in the section of the comments, and I hope that we will see each other in the next episode.